Climate change is disrupting food production and supply worldwide. Crops, fruit, livestock and transport are all affected. Permanently higher inflation may result, as well as food security threats. What are the implications for people around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Climate change is driving global food prices higher, with crops ruined and harvests wiped out by extreme weather events. Staples such as rice, grains and livestock are all affected, as is the infrastructure needed to grow or transport them. Doesn't matter where you live, the impact is global. For richer nations, importing when domestic supplies run short is one option, but that leads to consumers paying more. Poorer countries don't have that luxury. Research suggests we're already feeling the impact. Higher food prices are driving up inflation and may do so permanently. And that affects the cost of living across the board. So what are the implications? And are there solutions? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Kulsum Sharif.
This year, nothing is growing in Shamba Centre's garden. The small-scale farmer from northeastern Zimbabwe is one of millions of people in southern Africa affected by a severe drought. He grows vegetables to feed his family of 6 and sells the surplus to buy livestock. But now he has to rely on community kitchens for food.
This year, the rains were very bad and the dam is dry. We were not able to work in the garden.
In China, heavy rains and floods in April affected millions in the southern city of Shenzhen. Swathes of farmland were submerged.
I used to plant rice here, but now it's all flooded beyond repair.
Scientists say climate change is causing extreme weather patterns. Intense heat waves, prolonged droughts, and widespread flooding are becoming increasingly common worldwide and, in turn, crippling agricultural production. Rising global temperatures are expected to make matters worse.
There is a nearly 9 in 10 likelihood that at least 1 year between 2024 and 2028 will be the hottest on record. Even hotter than 2023, which smashed all temperature records.
Almost all agricultural sectors, from olive cultivation in Europe and cocoa farming in West Africa to fishing in the US, are impacted when production costs rise.
We humans did not succeed in foreseeing that climate change was going to knock on our doors as well as the rest of the world.
A study by the European Central Bank suggests higher temperatures alone will push up annual food prices. This in turn will add as much as 1.2% to overall inflation, affecting economies, consumers and producers.
Of course, the price rise impacts me. The prices are already affecting me financially, even before the bread price increase. We are barely making it with the current situation.
While countries worldwide are expected to be affected by climate-fueled inflation, poorer nations will struggle more from the impact of rising food prices. And farmers like Shamba will need to find other ways to feed their families. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Devon in the UK, George Monbiot is a passionate and prolific champion of the environment and author of the book Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. In Piedmont, Italy, Lei Win is a food systems and climate change journalist who authors the Thin Ink newsletter focusing on food and climate issues. And in Geneva is Carin Smaller. She's the Executive Director of the Shamba Centre for Food and Climate. She advises policymakers worldwide about agriculture and food systems. Great to have all of you on the programme. A lot to get through. George, I'll start with you in Devon. What role is climate change playing on rising food prices? I know the impact must vary from region to region, but broadly, what is its role on global food prices?
There's no question at all that it's pushing them upwards, but that also we have seen almost nothing yet. This is the beginning of what scientists call the shrinking of the human climate niche, the reduction of the areas where people can live and grow food. And what climate breakdown is doing is making food production harder and harder to the point where it will become impossible in many parts of the world, partly through rising temperatures alone. In some places, it will simply be too hot to work outside. The temperature will directly impact crop growth, partly because of the loss of soil moisture as temperature rises, the moisture is sucked out of the soil, partly because of ever more extreme events of the kind that we've just seen in your short film. It's a very dangerous situation indeed.
It's really worrying if you're saying that this is just the start of the impact, because we know that chronic hunger, after being on the decline from the 1960s, I believe, till about 2014, has been on the rise since 2015. Then let me bring you in there to pick up on one of the things that George touched on, which is the impact of rising temperatures on climate change. We know that there are many different impacts of climate change that affect food production in different ways. But if we look at rising temperatures, which is one of the things that we cover most when we look at climate change, what is its impact on things like staple crops, so many of which the yields are drastically reduced with higher temperatures?
Yeah, and I think, George explained very well exactly how that has an impact. But I think we also need to remember that higher temperatures, or at least, scientists have found and studies have found that rising CO2, in the atmosphere is not just going to have an impact on the yields. So not just the quantity of the food that's being produced, but also the quality of the food. They found that, the rising CO2 in the atmosphere could actually reduce key nutrients like protein, zinc, and iron in some of the staple foods. So we're talking about corn, wheat, rice. So, this is no longer just talking about affordability and accessibility of the food, but the fact that it would actually impact the fact that this food will be less nutritious as well. So it will have direct impact on our health too.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So you're saying that not only are we paying more for food, but we are paying more for food that's less nutritious. Carin, we know that higher food prices affect different people, different countries very differently. So who are you seeing as being most susceptible to the higher food prices because of climate change?
I mean, you saw it very well in your story, right? It's these poor smallholder farmers in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, all over Africa, who are the most vulnerable. And the real tragedy of this story is they are not the ones responsible for climate change. So we have a situation where those who have historically emitted the greenhouse gas emissions those who have not are the ones who are now paying the highest price. So that's the first thing I would like to say. The second thing is whilst it's obvious that climate shocks, or as George called it, the climate breakdown, has become the new norm, we don't need to trigger a crisis every time we have these shocks. Crises are man-made, and there are different ways to responding to these shocks, whether they're floods, droughts, or cyclones, that can make the impact of them lesser or worse. So I don't know if you want me to go into it now, but in Malawi, which is another country just next to Zimbabwe that you showed in your story, who's also been impacted by the drought, they had a failure in their maize production. And the drought was definitely one of the drivers. But what was also a driver was high fertilizer prices. There's been price gouging by the fertilizer companies, charging Malawian farmers 3 times more for their fertilizer than the world fertilizer price. So you have this compounding of less fertilizer being applied, a drought coming in as a shock, higher prices, and not enough food. And the third factor that's made...
Yeah,
yes.
I just want to pick up on one of the things you said. Why are farmers in Malawi being charged 3 times the price for fertilizers?
we've basically got a situation where there's only a few fertilizer companies around, so the huge amount of market power, and they dictate the prices. We've basically got cartels operating in the fertilizer sector in Malawi. But it's not just Malawi. Globally, fertilizer companies are very, very concentrated, and so they dictate the price. And in a country like Malawi, which is a price taker, they can't convince these companies that there's not a free market in fertilizer distribution, so they can't get it for a fair price.
Okay, and I do want to talk about, large corporations and their monopolies and how these affect the price of food as well. But before we get to that, I want to talk about some other ways that climate change itself is affecting food prices. George, could we see countries be more protectionist? I'm thinking of, India last year banned, I believe, some exports of various types of rice because of a shortage, and that drove up prices. Is that a concern that countries can resort to protectionism?
This is a very great concern, especially as when the human climate niche shrinks as it's beginning to do, many parts of the world will become more dependent on food exports rather than less dependent. And there's already a great deal of dependency on a few major exporting regions, such as the US, Canada, Russia, Ukraine. And we saw with the invasion of Ukraine how easily disruptions can occur when just one of those countries is taken out of production effectively. And we saw shelves being cleared across North Africa, across the Middle East, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we've got these very long connections now. We've got extreme dependency, countries, many of them becoming more dependent as time goes on. And as you so rightly say, we have a tendency by nations, when climate breakdown hits, to batten down the hatches, to say we've got to feed our own people first, we're going to put export restrictions on. All of these things combine to create an ever less stable system. And perhaps this is something we can come on to, but the real fear in my mind, bigger than any of the things that we've talked about so far, is that disruptions like this could trigger food system collapse. There's been a series of papers going back about 12 years now in the scientific literature saying that in many respects the global food system looks rather like the global financial system in the approach to 2008.
And so, George, what does a food system collapse mean? Since you say that that's what we might be looking at, what does it look like?
It's almost unimaginable. I mean, I consider myself a pretty hard-bitten journalist, but I find it very hard to go there in my mind. I mean, it basically means that the rich will eat and nobody else will. It could be triggered, for instance, by the collapse of one of the huge companies which dominate food. For instance, 90% of the world grain trade goes through just 4 corporations, a very dangerous situation. Or it could be triggered by an environmental event of the kind that we've been seeing. But the system has become fragile for very similar reasons that the financial system became fragile. And if the financial system had gone down, it would have caused enormous human suffering. If the food system goes down, we're talking about suffering on a whole other scale, unimaginable.
Finn, what are the ways in which we can stop the food system collapsing? George was talking about there's far too much dependence on exports. We saw that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that did to grain prices. Is producing food locally one of the answers?
Yeah, so, I think one of the things I do want to say is we can't just talk about, climate impacts on harvest and food prices and the possibility of a food systems collapse without talking about the other side of the coin, which is food systems contribution to climate change, right? Because emissions are built into almost every single aspect of the way we currently grow, produce, harvest, process, transport, consume, and discard food, right? We use fossil fuels for our machinery, for processing, for transport. There's energy used in the production of fertilizers and pesticides in the kind of large-scale industrial agriculture that seems to be, very prevalent, particularly in the rich countries these days, right? The way we produce particular type of food, like flooded rice fields emit methanes. The type of food that we produce, like livestock, also emit methane, right? And then, so when we waste perfectly good food, that is also associated with the emissions. So, agriculture produces 3 greenhouse gas emissions: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which directly contribute to climate change. So if we want to talk about avoiding a food systems collapse, we also need to talk about the role that food systems play and how we can reduce the impact of food systems on climate change.
Yeah, you're talking about a vicious cycle where climate change impacts food production and hence food prices, but the way everything about the food production system is actually exacerbating climate change. Carin, as someone who, really advocates for helping farmers, for, supporting especially poorer farmers, how do you support food production and, people to produce food locally, to be less dependent on exports and that international system with large corporations having monopolies, while still protecting the planet?
So this is a really hard one, and I want to come back to some of the things you've discussed before. For me, exports and trade is not the problem. Often in the case of a shock, we need more trade, not less trade, because where the shock happens might be local, right? The drought in Zimbabwe wiped out Zimbabwe's production. It needs to import more food to satisfy its needs. So the idea is not less exports and less trade. The idea is less concentration. So we don't want 3 countries supplying all of our staples, and we don't want 3 companies trading all of our staples. We need more, less concentration in the market, and then we need more options for trading. The case I gave you in Malawi, the third thing that went wrong was trade policy. The Malawian government closed the borders at the moment of this crisis, whilst next door in Tanzania and Uganda, there were bumper crops. If they had kept their borders open to the overproduction that happened in Tanzania and Uganda, the crisis or the collapse of the food system that's currently taking place in Malawi, where we are now 1 in 5 people are hungry, don't have enough calories, could have been avoided. So I think the role of government and the role of public investment in making sure there's more choice in the system, more local, more regional, more global options to trade is going to be absolutely critical to making sure that we're more resilient to these shocks.
George, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yes, I mean, I strongly agree with Carin's analysis. I think she's absolutely right here. It's very easy, and a lot of people do it, to say, well, if the problem is this import dependency, then the answer is localization. But the harsh truth is that many places where large number of people live just do not have enough fertile land and water to grow their own crops. There's a simple mathematical reason why not everyone can be fed locally. There was a paper published in Nature Food showing that the average minimum distance over which the world's people can be fed with staple crops is 2,200 kilometers. So we are going to need trade, there's no question, and the movement of food around the world, difficult and problematic as this is, but we have to make it much fairer. We have to break up the corporations. We have to break the grip of this tiny handful of super powerful corporations which exert leverage over government and destabilize the system. That's a key element here.
And is enough of that being done thin?
Well, clearly not. Otherwise, we won't be in the situation that we are in, right? I mean, just to reiterate what Carin and George said, I think we're having a discussion at the moment around, climate change and its impact on food price inflation. But sometimes, we blame climate change because it's an easier, sort of almost like easier to talk about it rather than talk about persistent inequality between the global south and the global north, the concentration in the food systems, not just the grains and the fertilizers, but even, everything from genetics of the livestock and poultry to pesticides, to agrochemicals, the massive concentration in the sector, and agricultural policies that for very many decades have focused extremely narrowly, purely on productivity and efficiency, and not thought about what could be the impact on nutrition, the impact on the planetary health. That's this is the result. What we really need is, lots of people have talked about it, food systems transformation, right? And that has been talked about so much that sometimes it has lost its meaning. But what we need is a system that is much fairer, much healthier, and much more environmentally friendly. At the moment, it is not happening. There are too many vested interests, blocking a lot of the changes that need to happen.
Okay, Carin, let me bring you in, because I know that there's billions of dollars being spent, at least being pledged, and billions of dollars being spent on climate financing. What are they being spent on?
Okay, so here is exactly where we need to be going to find some of the solutions. So at the last COP, we had the emergence of this climate fund to help countries adapt to climate change. And countries have pledged between $80 and $100 billion to finance this climate transition. But a research paper done by the Climate Policy Institute found that less than 1% of climate finance is going to support these smallholders, like the ones that we've seen in the stories that you've shown. Less than 1%. The bulk of the money is going in the energy transition, in the transport sector, green infrastructure. But we need to see much more of that climate finance, that money, that capital going in to the food sector, to smallholder farmers, so that they can become more resilient to climate change and can get themselves out of hunger and poverty.
And George, what do you think the solutions are? I know that you think that agriculture is one of not the biggest problems for why we are in this situation. So can it be part of the solution?
Well, it very much can be. And some of the things that Finn was saying are really important. Switching towards a plant-based diet is one of the main ways in which you can massively reduce the environmental impact of agriculture. It reduces land use and emissions by about 3/4. And so many of the problems to do with agriculture are actually to do with livestock. The huge amount of land it requires, the massive greenhouse gases that it produces, the amount of grain which is channeled into farm animals rather than going directly to humans, all these make the system more dangerous for the planet and less resilient.
But
So
George, who
that's a
does
big
that
step,
apply?
but-
And who does that big step apply to? Because, I'm thinking of, we have access to a plant-based diet, but there's many people in parts of the world who don't have access to as nutritious a plant-based diet as we do, right?
So I'm very much aiming at this at people who have a choice in their diets, and the meat eating level is much higher in rich nations than it is in poor nations. So those of us who have a choice, those of us who are surrounded by food, as many in the rich nations are, should use that choice as wisely as we possibly can. Obviously, for many of the world's people who have no choice as to what they eat, I'm not going to wag the finger at them and say you should be eating differently. But those of us who can switch to a different diet, a more earth-friendly diet, have not just a responsibility to do so, we have a moral duty to do so.
And then what would...
I would go a step further.
Yeah, sure, Carin, go ahead.
I think George is absolutely right. Where we are consuming too much meat, because frankly, meat and dairy are where the bulk of our emissions are coming from. Where we're consuming too much of it, so basically all of the high-income countries, but also a lot of the emerging economies, like China, too much meat consumption already. We need to reduce it, and the only way to do it is to tax it, like we tax tobacco, like we tax sugar. It's the only way to get it down in the speed at which we need to get the emissions down to save our planet and to help people, like the people in Zimbabwe, not be in that situation. The second thing is, as George said, the people who are currently in the poorest countries need to eat more animal source proteins like dairy and meat, because otherwise they're malnourished. So for them to get rid of stunting and wasting and to not be malnourished, They need to get the calcium, they need to get the B12, they need all these vitamins that we absorb through consuming the animal source foods. But if they follow the same model that the high-income countries or the industrialized countries have followed, then in 20 years' time, we end up with the same problem. So we have to think about what the right mix of this transition looks like to help people get out of malnutrition today, but not to create in 10 years' time the same problem that we've created in the rich countries.
And Finn, who do you see implementing these things or even thinking about these things, you know, in a way that's practical?
Well, it has to be a broad-based alliance, right, of pretty much everybody.
But do you see it happening? Yeah, do you see it happening anywhere?
Well, okay, so I want to give, I guess, perhaps I want to make 2 points. One is that, you know, Carin earlier was talking about the fact that, you know, a lot of the climate finance actually doesn't go to smallholder farmers or even around, you know, sustainable food systems. There is currently hundreds of billions of dollars a year in terms of subsidies that governments are currently giving, mainly to, you know, commodities, quite a lot to meat as well, on stuff that are emissions heavy, right? And not necessarily nutritious either. That can be repurposed. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but there is money if there is political will, right? But there are also examples. Carin talked about Malawi as an example, and I want to talk about Malawi as well, because last year I went to north of Malawi in Ikwandini with a Malawian NGO, nonprofit called, I think, Soils, Food and Healthy Communities. And what they've done is they started out as a project to reduce malnutrition in children, which then sort of became a multifaceted, interdisciplinary project that tackled things like gender inequality and gender dimensions around, you know, farm work. They introduced intercropping, growing different crops in proximity, planting trees, and focusing on indigenous, you know, varieties.
Yeah, and we know, Finn, I'm so sorry, we'll run out of time, but we know that all of these things are interlinked. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think that we could have all spoken. I could have certainly listened to all of you for a much longer time, but we have run out of time. I want to thank all of you. That is George Monbiot in Devon, Lei Win in Piedmont, and Carin Smaller in Geneva. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.